Great, we can get started. Hopefully everybody who wanted to join us will have found their way into this room by now. So hi everyone, welcome to this panel on accountability in action, exploring, hang on. Kate did just tell me to turn the microphones on and I had already completely forgotten. So hi everyone, welcome to this panel on accountability in action, exploring the need for effective feedback loops in humanitarian research. I'm Carrie Holloway. I'm a research fellow at the Humanitarian Policy Group at ODI Global, and I'll be moderating our session today. So in case you don't know who ODI Global is, we are a leading think tank, global affairs think tank, and one of the teams within ODI Global is the Humanitarian Policy Group, and within HPG, we focus specifically on humanitarian policy and practice. You can find out more about us on our website, so odi.org, which is very easy, hopefully, to remember. You can sign up there for our newsletter, as well as find us and follow us on LinkedIn and Blue Sky, if you so desire. Today, I'll be joined by three excellent panelists who will be sharing their own experiences in closing the feedback loop in humanitarian research. First, we'll hear from Sophie Joseph, the Director of Policy and Climate at Ground Truth Solutions, an organization working with crisis-affected communities to understand what they need, prefer, and prioritize, and how the aid they're receiving is meeting their needs. Sophie's worked all over the humanitarian system for the last 15 years at FCDO, OCHA, CALP, and as a climate researcher, so very wide variety of skills. Next, we have Lean Fouad. Lean's a senior research officer with the Humanitarian Policy Group at ODI Global with experience in conflict analysis and policy research. Her areas of work have covered a range of global humanitarian issues, including internal displacement, protection, and the role of narratives in policy agendas. And then finally, we have Ellie Kemp. Ellie is the Strategic Partnerships Director at Clear Global. So Clear Global is a nonprofit working to help people get information and be heard, whatever their language, through everything from translation to data and research to developing language language AI for marginalized languages, which sounds really interesting, but I don't know if we'll have time to get to that today. And Ellie has over 25 years experience in the sector in a range of roles at both local and headquarters levels. So I'm going to start off by giving a few questions to Sophie, and then we'll move to Lean and then move to Ellie. So Sophie, your first question. I feel like I'm on a game show of some sort. Yeah. And before you start, if you could also just turn your mic on. So this week at HMPW, we've already heard about the various priorities that we need to be thinking about as the implications of recent aid cuts start to take hold. You've just published a new report this week or last week that offers a different way to think about our priorities and how we might decide what to do next. So can you tell us a bit more about what you found?
Generous question. And yes, I can talk about our report. Thank you very much. So thanks, really pleased to be part of this panel. This issue of closing the feedback loop and working with communities to share the analysis, work together with the analysis that, after all, they have been the authors of, is something that's really dear to Ground Truth Solutions' heart. It's something that we've always tried to do and something that we are trying to do with more focus and intensity going forward. So those of you who've seen me on a couple of panels this week, I apologize for the repetition, but we have just published a report looking at the last 2 years of our data. So that's 34,000 conversations with individuals across 12 countries experiencing crisis. And we've tried to approach that data with the current moment in mind. So as conversations are happening right now about the prioritization of the humanitarian system, the humanitarian reset, how we're going to, what we can salvage with potentially 50% of the funding that we had last year. We think it's particularly important that the views and priorities of people experiencing crisis, that what these decisions are for, are front and center in these discussions. Have we missed the boat? Maybe. I've heard some really disheartening things this week about how quickly and how quickly the conversations have been going, how perhaps regressive some of the steps that are being taken are. But regardless, when we ask people experiencing crisis what is most important for them from the future of humanitarian assistance, we hear 5 key things. So the report has 5 key imperatives in it. First of all, the growing importance of community-led assistance and mutual aid, in particular as international assistance scales down, mutual aid, community-led assistance is shouldering relatively more of the burden of supporting communities. And we pose the question, what would it look like for the global humanitarian system to better support those efforts rather than pretending them coming in on top? And I think on the Gaza panel, potentially this was one of the things that was talked about, is how the international response and the mutual aid response hooked into each other or did not. So we'd be interested to hear more about that. Secondly, unfortunately, we need to build a humanitarian system fit for a more violent and lawless world. There are more conflicts. Those conflicts are following the rules less and less. Civilians are increasingly in the firing line, and the people we speak to live in fear of their lives more than at any other point where we've been doing these surveys. And so emergency assistance needs to navigate that reality, realise that emergency assistance itself is a target, and continue to deliver. The third is, as the climate crisis really bites, people are telling us they are increasingly concerned about their futures, and they want support with their long-term aspirations. They want long-term sustainable support that helps them build a better future. Fourth, and where I'm going to focus for this panel, where we are going to focus for this panel, embracing the potential of information as aid. If we have less money and less stuff to go around, there is a greater role that information can play, and we need to really lean into that and work with communities to maximise the potential. And fifth, we're still failing to meet the needs of the most marginalised people, to reach the most marginalised people with stuff at the right time. It's basic, but it's very, very important in a moment of prioritisation that we get this right. So we really hope that this piece of evidence can contribute to driving a more people-centred, community-led approach to the humanitarian reset. This prioritisation exercise could either be driven behind closed doors in New York and Geneva based on who shouts the loudest and who does the best at business as usual, based on what we had to do and how we would prefer to work, or it can be a more radical rethink of how we engage with crisis affected communities with the little resource we have, and how to do that in a different and more future fit way. So just before handing back to you, where I think where the most relevant place to focus today is this chapter about making information work harder, and what more can we do with information as aid. And three key messages came out of our research on that. First of all, is around early warning. We, as all of you in the room know, have the technology to see many disasters coming and to communicate that information to communities in actionable ways. But we hear that in particular for marginalised groups, and as Ellie will, I'm sure, go into more detail on people who speak minority languages, they're not getting the right information to do the right thing at the right time. So how can we do better on early warning? Secondly, people just aren't getting the basic information about aid. What are they eligible for? Who is eligible? How have difficult prioritisation decisions been made? And how do you access aid safely? The third and most important one, I think, is that people feel that two-way information exchange is still being massively underutilised. The tiny minority of people feel that they have any say in the decisions that affect them around aid. And of the people that have been able to speak to aid providers, have been able to put their needs on the table, a shrinking minority of them feel that those concerns will be listened to. So that's a very general intro into what we're thinking. Happy to dive into more detail on that, but back to you.
Yeah, thank you. You've kind of touched on some of these challenges that organizations are currently facing. You touched a bit on the world becoming more violent and lawless, the aid sector having to do with much less funding than it has been used to in the past. I'm just wondering, if you see any opportunities for the type of approach that you're suggesting, and how what you're suggesting could kind of transform approaches to advocacy in particular.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to caveat this by saying it's a really difficult line to walk, and I've seen it walked horribly wrong this week, because let's be very clear, what is happening to funding is a disaster. It's a disaster for all of us. It's hitting crisis affected communities the hardest. Truth Solutions has conducted some quick research across 11 countries looking at the impacts of the aid cuts. We just published the data for Sudan today. It's really, really difficult. People are dying, people are suffering, and it's all completely needless. And let's not go into why these decisions are happening, but this is first and foremost a disaster. Within that disastrous frame, this is of course also an opportunity to do the things that we've been talking about for a decade, because we'll be forced into it. We'll be forced to localise assistance. We haven't done it of our own volition for the last several decades. And hopefully we will be forced to think more creatively about how we work with communities and understand their needs and priorities, so that we can build an international aid system that is more fit to what we want. So there is opportunity for change, but let's be clear, it's not cause for celebration. So as I mentioned this, really excited about the topic of this panel today, because closing the loop has always been a really important part of how Ground Truth Solutions works, and we've set the ambition to do it more and do it more intentionally. And we do that for two reasons. We bring research back to communities for two reasons. First of all, because they are best placed to give meaning to the findings, to help co-create with us and other humanitarian actors the what should be done about it. And so they have a very role to play in that. One side note is that we are just in the next week or so publishing a series of user journeys in Ukraine of people receiving different types of cash assistance. So an injured member of the military, someone receiving cash assistance for a small business grant, someone receiving cash assistance for agriculture. And those user journeys were written by groups of people who are receiving cash. So trying to give a more prominent role to people with lived experiences who are best placed to tell us what's going on there. And then the other reason is that we hope, and this is, I'm hoping to learn more about this today because we're testing the theory, that by closing the loop and bringing research back, we can arm communities with data that they have anyway given us to be in a better position to advocate for what they want and to hold local values and local government and others to account. And we already have some relatively good stories to tell about this from both Haiti and Ukraine, where communities in Haiti and local aid providers in Ukraine took the research that we had done together and used it in the media and to lobby with humanitarian actors to say, this is the situation, we need to change it. And we want to see how we can go further there. The obvious elephant in every room this week is in a funding crisis, it's a difficult time to argue for doing things differently, especially things that require extra budget. But I would argue, I'm sure that we would all argue, of course, that when funding is being cut, this is the moment that we really need to be creative about embracing the potential of information as aid and what can we do with information. And I think as we go forward in our work and interested to learn from others, we want to test how closing the loop can support people holding actors to account and getting what they need. Can closing the loop be a platform for joint advocacy so that individual voices are coming together and are raised when they're doing that advocacy? And can it better connect the global decision-making fora with the community level? Can this help to act as a bridge between community members and the rooms where decisions about them are being made? I tested this theory out on a prep call, so I'm still, this is still a Sophie theory rather than a Ground Truth theory. But what's noticeable at this moment is that all of our organisations are somehow managing to safeguard comms. People are losing their jobs left, right and centre, but no comms people are losing their jobs, because this is a really important moment to shout about what we're doing to get support for the notion of humanitarian assistance. So I think it's true that we're all prioritising comms. What if we took even a quarter of that comms budget and used it to communicate with the communities who we've collected data from and done the research with? Our theory, my contention, is that is equally as important as shouting to global organisations or the rest of the world at the moment. And it would be really interesting to see the impacts of paying more attention, putting more budget and time behind communicating research back to communities that can be achieved in that way. More questions than answers. Back to you.
Well, hopefully Lean can answer some of those. Big task, but this is something, closing the feedback loop is something that we talked a lot about at the Humanitarian Policy Group over the past year and a half. And it's something that Lean's been working on with Ellie actually around the recent independent review to the humanitarian response to internal displacement that Lean was working on. So now we're going to go from kind of maybe slightly more theoretical, although you had loads of examples in there as well, Sophie, but maybe a bit more to the how does this actually play out in practice, or how has this played out in practice? So leave it over to you.
Thank you, Carrie. Yes, you're right. We have our interest and work on this have been based on the IS commissioned independent review of humanitarian response to internal displacement, which is here. We should have copies around.
Doesn't look nearly long enough.
I'm gonna get to that. This is just a summary. So we carried out this research over 18 months from a group of researchers at the Humanitarian Policy Group and a group of experts. And the review sought to answer a critical question: is the humanitarian system responding adequately to IDPs' needs, not just in terms of assistance, but also to ensure their protection and rights? To answer this question, as with any question in humanitarian research, or I would hope so, we have to consult with affected populations themselves, so IDPs and host communities. But this is where we found a slight issue, was that consulting with affected populations was being done on somewhat of a box-ticking exercise, and it wasn't taking place in a meaningful way. The review analyzed data from 6 countries. We went to DRC, Yemen, Ethiopia, Honduras, Mozambique, and Nigeria. And this is where internal displacement remains, for until now, a significant challenge. So over the course of the review, our priority was to talk to people who are internally displaced themselves and host communities. So we consulted approximately 1,500 IDPs in IDP camps, host communities, leaders, women's groups, people with disabilities, youth groups, with hosts and with local officials. And this helped paint a robust picture in terms of the findings, one of which was that the sector is not meaningfully engaging with IDPs or ensuring their full participation in decisions that directly affected their lives. The finding underscores why we must rethink our approach to accountability to affected populations and feedback mechanisms in humanitarian research. So one of the main priorities following the launch of the review has been to reinforce the idea that IDPs must be at the heart of humanitarian response, not just as sources of data, but as active participants in shaping solutions. We also wanted to arm IDPs with information, as Sophie mentioned, about what the sector is doing for them, in hopes also for them to use this data to put pressure on decision makers and humanitarian actors working in country and working with these communities to do what the report and what other humanitarian reports set out to do for them, and also to hold decision makers to account. So in practice, what we did, initially we worked with our national partners in the 6 countries that I mentioned to determine what languages would be most effective in reaching affected communities. And we were helped by Global, by Ellie specifically. With that, we provided her expert guidance on language selection. And 2, we wanted to know what kind of information do IDPs themselves want to hear. We didn't want to just go and say, you should hear about this review, and this is what we did. So rather than simply summarizing the IDP review, which I got to that point, which was 150 pages of like technical language, of jargon, of things that even people within the sector sometimes didn't really get. We wanted to take a different approach and focusing on extracting most relevant information for IDPs. And this resulted in the creation of a 2-page document that distills the review's purpose, key findings, recommendations, and next steps. It was done in a way that was accessible to those who need it the most. So Clear Global then conducted a plain language review to ensure that the information was understandable by non-research audiences. And once finalized, the 2-pager was translated to around 2 languages per country. And then we did audio recordings that were done in a like podcast style way, so like conversation of 2 people talking about the review. And the idea was to disseminate this research either WhatsApp messages or radios, but that had some challenges, but I'll get to the challenges later. And then the next step was to ensure that this information reached IDPs effectively. So we initially talked with NRC and OCHA, who hosted the review, to distribute the materials through their networks, hoping that this would somehow cascade down to IDPs themselves. But we recognize that this might be a challenge and might primarily reach IDPs themselves. It might reach UN leaders in country, cluster leaders, rather than like IDP communities. To address this, we reached out to UN agencies from different countries, providing them with the scripts and the recordings for them to share it with the communities that they support. We also worked with our national partners who would disseminate this information in various methods. For example, focus group discussions, radio sessions, talking to IDP community committee leaders and grassroots organizations who would maybe organize sessions and talk to IDPs themselves. I'm going to stop here and back to you.
I'm just gonna maybe make you go back to some of those challenges that you kind of touched on, but didn't want, you dived into loads of challenges, to be honest, but maybe we can pull out a few of the key challenges that not only you face, but that you think that other research organizations or NGOs might also face if they're trying to think about how do I take a piece of research back to the communities from which I got it from.
So I think I would categorize them in three strands. I would say dissemination itself was slightly challenging, then the funding, and then the type of dissemination. So what I mean by the dissemination itself is one of the major obstacles after the review, because the review has been conducted over 18 months, and that was launched last March. So that's been it's been a year now. So I would say over 2.5 years. The shifting political and conflict and security dynamics in the countries that we work in has changed. I think I would say DRC and Yemen have been the ones more prominent. So since the review was commissioned, there has been further internal displacement in DRC. I'm going to focus on those two countries. Further internal displacement, many IDP communities have been displaced again, they have moved elsewhere. So reaching the people who we collected data from is challenging, let alone maybe impossible. Our national researchers that worked with us themselves are unable to reach some of these communities, are even unable. I've spoken to our national researcher in DRC who said he's unable to enter Goma, and he's from Goma, so he's just unable to reach those communities, even any IDP communities. And the second one was the lack of funding, and this is a major theme in every single panel that we've done. And I think this has been pre-USAID funding cuts, and I think funding to dissemination activities, let alone funding to dissemination to affected communities themselves is always an afterthought. It's never thought about in the beginning, at least from major donors. I think this financial limitation restricted the number of partners that we could engage with, and that means the reach that we could have with this project. We have engaged with donors since, we've brought this idea to them, we brought this concept to them, and many of them would be like, this is great, this is an amazing idea, but don't have the money for it. Good luck with your research. So it's always been like, so you're telling me you're finding this idea very important, but then why are you unable to fund it? So I think the bigger challenge is how do you keep accountability to affected population and meaningful engagement with affected communities a top priority for donor countries? I don't have the answer to that, unfortunately. And then the final challenge would be the type of dissemination, as I mentioned. So we discussed radio, we discussed WhatsApp messages, but we don't know what IDPs themselves have access to. And to know what IDPs themselves have access to, we must do this kind of research in a wide scale, and we don't have money for it. So I guess all of my challenges are related. Let's stop here, if that's okay. And then
We'll shift to Ellie and ask her some hard questions. And let you off for a minute. So Ellie, we've heard from Sophie and Lane both about the challenges, but also the potential to working with affected communities and how they can use the results of our research to advocate on their own behalf. What can organizations do to help improve this already? Like, what are the easy steps? What is the low-hanging fruit?
I think in that context where it hadn't been planned in advance and there wasn't a budget for it specifically, so ODI went to some lengths to make sure that they found some resources to make this happen. We did what were the easier things to do. We took the low-hanging fruit. So doing a summary, because our 300-page humanitarian reports really, I'm not sure how many people read to the end within the sector. So but doing a plain language edit, so not speaking our jargon, not using technical terms, frankly, steering away from abstract nouns as far as possible. But you know, there's a lot of information out there about plain language as a standard, and we don't apply it very well as a sector generally. But it's about speaking in terms that are going to be more familiar to people, using active nouns, active phrases, etc. and focusing on and signposting what the key points are that you want the readers to take away or the listeners to take away. There's multiple formats. So having a text version for people, for instance, who have a hearing problem or a visual problem, but audio or face-to-face, the different formats, the different engagement mechanisms that are going to work for different people will, multiply many times how far you can reach. And adapting, so we had to, as Lean was saying, we adapted it for a kind of a podcast. So just making it something that you might want to engage with in a different way. But then the big thing is, which languages should all of that happen in? And the starting point often is we don't know. So when we had a discussion, Lean and I, and then actually it wasn't me, I got our experts internally to take a look at which languages. But if you're saying, which languages do IDPs in DRC speak? There are 200 languages spoken in DRC, and actually nobody's mapped that because there's not great data available from government sources, and multi-sector needs assessment sources gives us some good data for some parts of the country. So one of the key challenges within the sector generally is making sure that you know which languages you need to engage with people in. But right at the beginning, as you were saying, Lena, there wasn't a discussion with IDPs in these contexts of what would be relevant for you. What do you think, the system needs to know, the donors need to know about your situation? And of course, the conversations that ODI and its partners had with, and its local researchers had with IDP were about that, were about, making their voice heard. But there wasn't a discussion, we're not involving them in our conversations. I think we're very global of being guilty of that in our own research. We haven't always done as GTS systematically does, and I take my hat off, and back and seen the people that we're here to serve as an audience for what we're saying, and as a judge of what we're saying. The issue of language and who you're hearing from, and who you're heard by, of course, but who you're hearing from, of course, is central to doing humanitarian research effectively, making sure that you're not just hearing from the people who have more resources, get heard generally within their own societies, and are perhaps less likely to be, or will be less vulnerable in the time of an emergency, at least fewer options to get out of it. And that does mean looking at how you do research in a language-aware way. We've done some work on this. We did a nice piece with the Safeguarding Resource and Support Hub a few years ago, which is available online, on specifically in relation to doing research on sensitive topics like safeguarding. And there are a few places where communication breaks down in participatory research. It breaks down if you're not asking questions and engaging with research participants in the languages and the dialects that they speak and understand and are comfortable in. So that you're sure that you're understanding them and they're understanding you, and they are actually speaking. GTS did a very nice piece, I think in the Rohingya response a few years ago, about the different answers you get when you've got insiders and outsiders asking questions, and that's part of it. But an insider speaking a different dialect from your own is not necessarily, doesn't feel like an insider to you as a participant. You don't want to exclude those who are most in need, and that means you're going to need to find out what the languages are that people are more marginalized within those communities. Clear Global provides some data on that. We have a language use-based platform which works for, at the moment, about 30 countries. You can get the information, and we're adding to that all the time. But mostly you need to ask people where you are, what are the languages that are spoken here. And you need to ask that not only of the better educated, more connected, already plugged into the humanitarian system or government structures, individuals. You also need to use the terms and the words and the concepts that people use themselves and that they're comfortable using. Particularly, of course, around sensitive topics, because we come with our whole bubble of ideas and not just jargon, but the way in which we carve up the world. All of us as humans is different in different cultures. So just to take an example from the kind of safeguarding end, rape, the word for rape or expressions for rape in different languages and contexts. It can, in some contexts, it's just something that a man can do to a woman. The Women's Refugee Commission did some great research, again in Bangladesh, where they found that if you want to talk about male rape with Rohingya communities, you need to use words that are associated with torture. And then men and boys know what you're talking about. But there are also words that can, so you may not be having a conversation about the same thing at all. But you could also be having a conversation where the terms that you're using or concepts that you're using carry a lot of stigma, as you can imagine in that context. So there is, I'm going to get the pronunciation wrong, and any Rohingya speakers listening, feel free to correct me. But there's a word that's used for rape in Rohingya, which is zina. It's also used for adultery. And the meaning, our research there with Rohingya refugees found that the meaning of adultery has kind of blurred into the understanding, the connotations of zina when you refer to rape. There's a connotation of it being basically consensual. And that means if you are talking to people about this, they may not feel so comfortable coming forward, speaking about their own experiences. Yeah, there are ways, there are tips in that resource for how you can address that, but where there is an outsider in the room, sometimes it can be helpful to have the outsider raise the tricky issue. Really important to ensure that your research team who will speak those languages, who will be leading those conversations with your research participants, that they are language aware and bringing through the research questions, the research tools together to talk about what are the concepts that are going to be tricky, how should we approach this, who might be embarrassed, and you have a kind of a setting ground rules at the beginning of your discussion with research participants of, okay, these are things that we would like to talk about, and I apologize if any of these are, what I'm talking about is uncomfortable in any way, and we would like to find ways together to talk about these. So, let's talk about the words that we are going to use in this conversation to discuss something that is important to you and to us. So it's a respectful way of doing it, but where you first establish what everybody means by it.
Great, thanks, Ellie. And just for those of you in the room and online, just to say, Ellie came to a team meeting we had a few months ago, which basically tried to teach us all how to do this better. And one of the things that really stuck with me was exactly what you're saying about finding out what language people speak. So we've started just introducing that question in like the background, getting to know you phase of every interview we do, hopefully. And just to find out, do we understand what language people are speaking? It's a very easy way to make sure that you've got the right data that you need when it comes to the impact. But just to follow on from what you were talking about at the end, I mean, there's power dynamics associated within language between how people speak about it, the words they use, what the power dynamics are between an interviewer and an interviewee, but also between marginalized communities and communities that hold more power. When we're thinking about feeding findings back to affected communities, power dynamics still play a part in that. So can you talk a bit more about that, about how to make sure that you're compensating, I guess, or mitigating power dynamics in language when you're thinking about what to feed back, what words you use, what language you use? Is it just about using more languages to make sure more people can understand, or are there other ways that you can make sure those power dynamics are kind of mitigated as much as you can?
That's a really hard one. That's not also, it's also not quite the question I thought I was going to be asked, so I'm going to wing it completely. But it's a great one. I mean, yes, language is power. I am speaking now, probably the most powerful language in the world, certainly the most powerful language in the international development and humanitarian sector. You can be a head of a UN agency and be a monolingual English speaker, which seems incredible. You couldn't possibly be a Rohingya speaker and have just that language. There was a great example of I feel like I'm coming up with no, I'm not only coming up with problems, but solutions. I would say the best way is to ensure that your research team are super aware, that they're well connected, that they're speaking with the people that you're trying to extract your information from. You have, you're co-researching basically with the people that you're attempting to amplify the voices of. And you talk to them at that stage about how we're going to feed this back and about those issues of language. That I know this is adding time on to what is often a time-pressured piece. But what we have seen is that local communicators do a vastly better job because they know for whom you actually have to go to their front door and talk to them, for whom it's a public meeting is going to be okay, who is going to want to hear it, maybe through the radio, so it's going to reach better, a better cross-section. But a lot of people will often tell us in our research that they'd like to have something in writing as well, even if they can't read it themselves, but they can get somebody else to do it. If you're talking about issues of accountability, I'd like to know what it was that so-and-so signed up to. And I'd like, you know, my child who reads when I can't, to be able to tell me about that. But there are challenges with that as well. So we had in the 2018, 2019 response in DRC, we did a lot of research with communities on what was going wrong in communication, what was scary, what was off-putting, what would simply didn't get across, and a lot about concepts and about the choice of languages. And we made a lot of research and tools, and we made some recommendations, and we did kind of, you know, multilingual glossaries of, you know, use these terms, not those terms, in local languages. And then that was the 10th Ebola outbreak, and then the 11th came along on the other side of the country. And that went from the feedback that we had from communities, the communication went much, much better. And as far as we could ascertain, that was largely because communication was being led by teams, local teams of communicators working in their own languages in communities that they knew. Women in particular who were really not happy, in the East, in the 10th response, said, I understand, I got the information that I needed, I'm doing fine. The one problem was the lowest status language in much of Central Africa. This is debate, well, one of the most low status languages, and English here. The Twa language is somewhere down there at my feet. They're a pariah community in a lot of Central Africa, including in large parts of DRC, and they're simply excluded. They can't join community meetings about whatever. They'll be chased out, or if they ask a question, they're not speaking the local language properly. So we found in our research in the 11th outbreak that they are so marginalized that if you ask the Twa people, Twa communities, what language they speak, they won't tell you that they speak Twa. They won't tell that there is they will tell you the locally spoken language. But actually among themselves, they speak this other language. And because they are so excluded from kind of mainstream society in Equateur, but in large parts of Central Africa as well, it didn't occur to anybody to have teams of Twa speaking communicators. And so nobody communicated with the Twa teams. Nobody except native Twa speakers will bother to learn Twa. There's absolutely no point. And so they didn't hear, and they didn't think it had anything to do with them. And I'd love to be able to give you the epidemiological results of that, and I can't. And there are highly marginalized groups in all societies, in my society, in your society. We need to be aware of that, and I think be looking for that. So I used to work a lot on protection. There is a dictum that assume that sexual violence is happening in an emergency. Assume that language marginalization is happening in an emergency. And just one last thing about the language is power. If your first language in Eastern DRC is not French, which it isn't, or Swahili, which is the bigger, better supported regional language, and the one that humanitarians might just make an effort to communicate in, international humanitarians, then you will learn it at school. So it's the people that don't get to school, or who maybe get 1 or 2 years of primary, that are most excluded when questions are asked, conversations are held only in Swahili or in Swahili and French. And, you know, pick any country in the world, that's more likely to be women and girls. It's more likely to be people living with disabilities. It's more likely to be older people. It's more likely to be members of particularly marginalized ethnic social groups, travellers and Roma in Europe, for instance, same issues. So the older disabled minority speaking woman, minority language speaking woman who's displaced by a conflict is the person you want to speak to, because she's the last person anyone's heard from. And she's the last person that is likely to get the information you're trying to get to her if you don't.
Great, thanks, Ellie. I don't know what question you expected me to ask, but I feel like that was a really good answer. I'm very happy that I asked it. 'Cause I feel like you've brought a few examples that really help, at least illuminate some of the things that you were talking about. So we're gonna open it up to questions from the floor now, but we don't just want it to be just questions. We're also happy to hear from everyone here in the audience and everyone online what your experience has been in trying to increase accountability in research and feedback your findings to affected communities. So any challenges that you've had, any successes that you've had, we really would like this to become a discussion if possible. So if you're willing to share your experience, we'd love to hear them, but otherwise you can just traditionally ask questions of the panelists, and I'm sure that they will answer as well. So I've got a colleague, Kate, who's going to be feeding me questions from online. So if I'm looking at my phone, it's not because I'm not paying attention, it's because she's feeding me questions via WhatsApp. And we've got another colleague here, Nick, who has a roving microphone. So if anyone does want to ask a question, we ask that you ask it into the microphone so that people online can hear you as well. And with anyone asking questions, if you don't mind introducing yourself so that we have a bit of an understanding of who you are, where you come from, what your background is, that'd be great. So yeah, any questions in the room? Otherwise, I will check to see if any have been submitted online. We've got two over here. Let's start here, and I'll have some queued up from online as well. Please.
Hey, I'm Tia with JRI Consulting, and we do evaluations, assessments, learning partnerships that are grounded in intersectional feminism. And it's kind of a question to the group, kind of a problem that we've encountered. So we always try to come back to do validation workshops with the people that we've interviewed from. It's something that's really important to us. One, to make sure that we understood accurately, but two, because we see it as an opportunity to bring people together to validate how they feel. Because oftentimes people are kind of pissed off about stuff. So it's useful to be in a room with other people who are pissed off about stuff. MPW. One of the things I find is this tension, because agencies get a little bit cagey when I'm like, no, we're gonna do this. They get a little bit cagey. And I think part of what happens is because this is now an accountability mechanism. So one is how to kind of grapple with that dynamic. But two, I often find that I don't have anything to say. So when I come back with like the management response, I've had the response of like, this is not new, so they're not going to do anything. Oh, wait, okay. So it's like sort of balancing the time that we've already taken for the interview, the time we've taken for the validation workshop, and the time to come back and say, actually, this agency is going to do jack about it. When you're just trying to like live your life and like, so I'd be curious about any other experiences with how to balance this tension. Is it just about pushing agencies to actually have something meaningful to say, or to like find the will to actually do something, or to be willing and open to being held to account by the people the program is interacting with? I don't know. I like feeling a bit salty about it, which is maybe coming through.
It's all right. Let's take a few questions and then we'll come.
Thanks. So I'm Susanna Davis. I'm a global lead for humanitarian child protection for the children. And I also spend part of my work working with the Alliance for Child Protection and Humanitarian Action, a global interagency network of about 212 agencies that work on child protection and humanitarian settings. I found the discussions really interesting, but I think my kind of question for all of the panelists, and it's also a bit of a reflection from my end, is both the extent to which in the different pieces of research and work that you're talking about, the extent to which children and children's participation was considered. And when you're talking about closing the loop and all these different formats that you were considering, the extent to which you did that with children of different ages and how you thought about like the child-friendly nature of materials. We know that this is like, even in my sector, and my sector should, child protection is not responsible for accountability to children. Humanitarians are responsible for accountability to children. And we know from a huge number of research pieces, including one that we recently did, that we're failing spectacularly. And that there is, it's an adult-centric world in general, and amongst humanitarians, children's participation is not prioritized, and accountability mechanisms that do exist, so above and beyond research and closing the loop, accountability mechanisms that do exist about the humanitarian response are adult-centric and controlled by adults and don't necessarily allow access to children. So, and I promise this will be the last thing that I throw out there. Children make up about 41% of forcibly displaced people in the world, of the forcibly displaced population in the world. Their percentage of the population in the world is 30%. They're disproportionately represented. In contexts like DRC, they are more than half. So my question is both, how do you consider this? And from people who maybe don't know your particular backgrounds, but thinking about like the wider humanitarian system that doesn't necessarily come from a child-focused background, how do we get over this like hump? How do we convince people to care about this? Because effectively, the majority of research and the majority of accountability mechanisms is ignoring about half of the population. And that's pretty unacceptable. So
Great. We'll take those two and then take another round. Hopefully. But I think these are two really important, really difficult questions. So I'll turn it to the panel, but also if anyone in the audience also has any reflections, I'm sure the panel would welcome your help. But first, yeah, no, that's all right. It's fine. We're here for hard questions. But maybe that first question around, we make sure that the time of doing all these touch points is worthwhile, if I'm understanding correctly, organizations that are in charge of these programs to not to care too much about what you actually find. So maybe over to Ground Truth for that one, because I feel like surely this is kind of
Sure.
like a work that you've done.
I'm ready. Can I have a quick go at both? And I promise I won't.
Yeah.
We've just done some work on the children's participation. So on the first one, I absolutely hear you. This is infuriating. The question, so I'm brand new to Ground Truth, so I'm sure I will get more infuriated with this over time, but one of the criticisms that we get from agencies is, oh, Ground Truth, you say the same thing every year, so we've stopped listening. Like, we say the same thing every year because you're not listening, because you're not doing anything about it. And I've had some direct comments this week along those lines. It's not our problem. It's not the community's problem that these things are not changing. It is your problem. And so unhelpful, so I don't know the answer, but I would turn it around on them and say, well, why have you just tapped into your precious humanitarian budgets to pay for this research if it's going to sit on a shelf and tick a box and you're not doing it? If there's no management response to what we found, if I can't go back to communities and say what's changed, then you've wasted your time and money and hours and the communities. But I don't know how you say that and then get repeat work. So maybe not super helpful. And then on the child participation one, I feel like one of my colleagues might have counted this question. We've just done some work in Burkina Faso looking at how to include children's feedback. And as a complete newcomer to this space, what surprised me was how heavy and difficult that work was, and how both working with children to say, it was okay, you can question this. This is a space where we want you to feedback your thoughts and feelings about this work. That takes work, and also priming people in positions of power to do it takes work. And so the work in Burkina Faso has been really interesting, but quite elaborate, just to set the stage to do that participation. I'm afraid I've come in new to the organisation, saw the work and said, this is so interesting, but we can't focus on this right now because no one in the sector has any money. And what my colleagues have challenged me on perfectly is, we can't tell you yet what the results of the work are because we haven't got to the stage where we have the substantive feedback. But we do know that how children see humanitarian priorities and humanitarian response is wildly different to what their parents see. And just one example that I got from UNHCR the other day, UNHCR saying that they've been working in northern Kenya with nomadic herdsmen, and they primarily talk to older people, and older people's incentive is to remain nomadic herdsmen despite the climate crisis and to keep doing it. And they said they switched and they had a focus group discussion with youths, and the youths were like, I don't want to see another camel as long as I live. Like, this livelihood is going out of commission. We are not interested in preserving it. We want to move to a city. We want to get digital skills. We want to do something different. Obvious to you, but they never would have known this had they not spoken to kids. So it's not an answer as much as a challenge. It's super important work. It's also challenging and quite resource intensive work just to get the ball rolling. I don't know, even for our own organisation right now, how we're going to balance that, and I don't know what the answer is. But I think if we can come out with the evidence that says, if you don't hear from children, you're going to miss the point, this Northern Kenya example, then we can start justifying some more of that work. Back to you.
Thanks, Sophie. I'm going to then go to Lane. I'm just doing it in the order they spoke, just because I feel like Ellie might need a rest. What she said. So I'm going to come to Lane next, and I think this first question is really interesting, maybe for Lane and for the IDP review as well, because it was such a broad review. It wasn't an evaluation of a particular project, so the recommendations are massive, and they're system wide, and it's stuff that isn't it. You're unable to go back and say, and this is what has happened because of this review, because it's so big and so broad that the changes, even if they, even if when it was published, people were like, yes, we'll get right on that, will not have happened yet. So I think, it's on one hand, it's difficult to go back and say, they're not going to do anything. That's really bad. I think on the other hand, something like this, if you go back to them and say, well, nothing's happened yet, and I can't tell you that it ever will in the future, that is also a tricky thing to say. So just wondering with the, maybe with the summary that you produced or the way that you fed it up to communities, was there any discussion of feedback findings about something that has not actually changed anything, and maybe some of those learnings were applicable?
Yeah, I think, you just mentioned it was like a system-wide response and not just about participation. It was about coordination. It was about leadership. It was about clusters. I remember anytime someone mentions something, I'm like, oh, the IDP review said this, and someone was like, is there a finding for every single sector? I'm like, yes, it crosses every single thing in humanitarian response. But there are 42 maybe like hundreds of findings and 42 recommendations. So the system can pick and choose whatever they want to apply. But I think in terms of you mentioned management response. There has been a management response for this, and there has been kind of like a recommitment for internal displacement and IDPs by the EASC and the ERC. So this is what we told IDPs. This was like, oh, you haven't been forgotten. I know you've been forgotten for the last 30 years, but you're back on the agenda now. Which is not great, but something. There has been an updated IDP policy, which they don't care about. They don't know what an IDP policy is, but we're trying to say that there has been some movement for IDPs, but I remember also having to write that in this 2-page summary. You probably won't see changes in your lifetime. So we know that this is going to be frustrating, but some people are trying to work to do something, even if that means putting IDP communities back on the agenda of those with the most power. And again, I don't know about the new ERC. I don't know if he's committed to IDPs. Martin Griffith has said, I care about IDPs, but then he left a month later. So, so I think, I don't know how you can balance this tension. But in this summary, we did mention saying that you probably won't see the changes in your lifetime, but this is what we're trying to do in the sector for you. Here's the information that you need to talk to humanitarian actors, to talk to like Save the Children on the ground, to talk to UNHCR on the ground and say, well, there's been this massive 18 months review and we haven't seen any changes. So what are you doing? We've asked for education, we've asked for livelihoods, and nothing has changed. You're still giving us water. You're still giving us like blankets that we don't need. So what are you doing really? I think this is what we're trying to do with this.
Yeah, I think you probably can't underestimate the value of honesty. I feel like I've done validation workshops before where I had the exact same experience where people were like, this felt more like a counseling session than any part of research. And I think that's also valid. I wouldn't see that as a, charm or anything, because I think people telling someone your feelings are valid and I hear you, I think is totally legitimate and something we should do more of, but also just being honest and say, I'm doing my best.
I have had this question posed to me several times in many different contexts. What is this going to change?
Yeah.
The fact that I know the answer is no.
Yeah.
That nothing is going to change is like a very dark and sad place. to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But also mislead anyone.
Yeah.
And I have said, you won't see it now, and I can't promise when you'll see it. We're trying, but I think the idea that how you maintain spaces like that, recognizing that what you're doing has no reciprocal benefit and is inherently extractive, it's just a really researcher.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's where we go back to what Sophie was saying about information as aid as well. If you are closing that feedback loop, if you're giving them back the findings, if you're saying you're not the only one who feels like this is what we found, arming them with information that they can then self-advocate for. Hopefully it can be slightly less extractive and more, at least you're giving them back the stuff that you took from them, basically. Not that I'm with you. I kind of hate being a researcher most of the time too. I'm just going to turn to Ellie on maybe this point. I mean, feel free to answer the first question if you want, but I think for global, I was really curious as to how you might tackle the second question around children participation. If you've done any work on that, I imagine playing language might work well for children, but is there a separate version of like children language as well?
Oh, I'd love to do a piece on that. You are, of course, absolutely right. As with any group, if you're not listening to them, no, sorry, I'm not meaning to be patronising at all, but it's just in the same way as I would say, you're not going to hear from that older disabled woman. And so you're not going to know what actually affects her, and your findings are likely to be irrelevant to her. Same for children. It's great to have that stressed. And we have done relatively little research with children because we have not got child protection specialists on the team, and we have taken. There have occasionally been suggestions. Well, we put together this project proposal, and we're going to do research with children. It's going to be great, and we've in the global team said, okay, so, but what are the safeguarding methods that you've prepared for, and who in the team has a plan for how we're going to go about keeping those children as untraumatized as possible by the experience. So when we have done it, so we haven't done very much of it. We probably haven't done enough of it. When we have done it, we've done it with child protection specialists. And when you do, it's fabulous. We haven't focused it on language, and I would love to. We did a nice piece with child refugees in Greece a few years ago, which was about their language journey, and it was fab, but it wasn't getting at the nuggets of how children communicate and how that's how they see the world and filter the world. We did a really nice piece, though, where I was stunned. It wasn't me doing it with our research lead, Christina Fricke, did a great piece a while back with World Vision on how children understand safeguarding materials that are developed for them. And the team together, so taking the child protection experts of World Vision and our anthropologist in chief, they were able to construct a piece of research that heard from children as young as like 3 and 4 up to 17, the different ways in which they interpreted predominantly visual information, of course, and what needed to be in place, how they saw faces, what wasn't clear to them, that of course was clear to their parents. And it was really powerful, and they haven't released the results of research yet, but I believe they're going to be doing it in the next few months. So, that's going to be a very useful piece of communication basis for, I think, speaking to children worldwide. 'Cause they've taken it to, I can't remember how many countries, a bunch of countries, to try it out and get the feedback from children across their programs. I hope that is going to turn out to be useful for children, and that does not obviate what you're saying about we're not, as a sector, looking out specifically to hear enough from children. And of course, along with older people and people with disabilities, children are one of those groups that haven't had much time in school, very often to learn the dominant language if that wasn't their first language. And so that's one of the groups we really need to be aware of in that as well. Thank you for the question.
Great. Thank you for those. They were hard, but I feel like they were really good. Let's get back up to the floor. We've got a question in the back, so Nick, you're gonna have to go down. So we'll take that one. If anyone else, I don't think there's been any questions online yet, so we can keep the questions in the room if anyone else has one. I'll just wait to see if it gets fed to me.
Not so much a question, but kind of a,
Oh, sorry, can you just
Addition?
introduce yourself?
yeah, Jock Baker, independent consultant, including with the ODI and Larry before. Nice to meet you in person.
Yeah.
So I've been doing evaluations for 20 years now, so maybe mostly for humanitarian. So maybe just a couple of reflections on what was said. First of all, in terms of children, I sort of got drawn into this through UNICEF and doing evaluations for SAVE, and they have quite good guidance for doing this. So it's no need to reinvent the wheel, but involve SAVE and UNICEF, because they know how to do. They've had a lot of practice actually for this thing, because they interview children not just for evaluations, but they do it for all their work as they go along. The second thing, in terms of getting buy-in from clients, I mean, for me, one thing I've learned is to include in the initial assessment during the inception phase, have some interviews and things like that. One of the important things to know is what they want out of this thing, because it's one thing to tell them to do stuff, but you have to start from understanding first what they really want to find out and see where the alignment is with the terms of reference, because they're the ones that wrote the terms of reference. There must be a reason why they put things in there. The second thing is that there's you kind of understand the limitations. So they have, what did you say, 145 recommendations, IDB?
42.
42, that's a lot of recommendations. So so they have a limited capacity, they have limited time, and they may have other kinds of constraints. So getting an understanding of what that is. Then, so that's the front end, and throughout, you kind of check in with them as you go along. At the end, I usually have a validation workshop, which spends half a day on just the draft recommendations. And I ask two questions. One is, are they relevant? Well, three questions actually. Is this a priority? Are they relevant? And are they achievable? Okay, so normally priority, if we've done our work right, priority is easy. Okay, yes. Relevant, yes. Achievability, they start thinking, okay, so can we actually do this, and how do we do it? And that's very often, if we, in about half the time, we can really already understand what the management response is going to look like, because they've in group work, they've already articulated how we're going to do this and what the limitations are. We're going to manage that. So just a couple of points.
Yeah, just take the microphone back, because I'm not sure. I mean, it's not ours.
Yeah, thank you for that. None of what you said is dissimilar from what we already do. I would say we actually start with some of those questions that you ask in the inception workshop in the interview, because I don't want to do stuff that has no meaning for me. The problem is there's a real big distance between the commissioning team, who are always like, yes, we want to learn. We're so hungry to learn new things and change. And one of the questions I ask is, how open are you to learning? Because the commissioning team is always like, yes, tell us everything. And then the second question is, how open is your institution or organization to change and to hear difficult feedback? Depending on that answer is influences how far that conversation goes with me in that space. I kind of feel like I get catfished a little bit. So what happens is that by the time I get to the end of it, depending on what I found, that influences whether or not they're interested in picking it up. So exactly the same in terms of validation workshops, the approaches you take is a kind of, what is it, like the rhetoric reality gap grows the further away I get from things. I just think there's a kind of, I don't totally know what it is, because you're not wrong. Well, they also go in circles. They also go in circles, right?
Yeah.
So any other questions in the room? Just, I do have one online if nobody else has a burning question. So this one is, it's bringing back the conversations we are having, that we've been having all week, that everyone's been having around the funding in the sector. How do you, what do we, because we all in this room agree, right? We all agree that we should be feedback research findings to affected communities. If you don't, I'd love for you to raise your hand and tell us why you don't. But I imagine this is quite an echo chamber. But what we need to do is kind of have the conversations around how do we, what do we say to our funders? What do we say to our donors to show the value of this work, why it's important? How do we get, you know, how do we get them to agree in advance that actually we do need to put this into our budget, that we do need to make time for this, that it is important, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know if anyone on the panel has examples of how they've been successful, or maybe we can just have a group brainstorm or commiseration around how hard it is to do this. But I do feel like, you know, a common narrative around this could potentially be helpful in terms of, you know, sometimes you just have to tell people multiple times that something's important. And if we're all saying the same thing multiple times, this is important because of this, then maybe it would actually get somewhere. So again, we'll just go in the order you spoke. So Sophie, I'll hand it to you first.
Thanks. Yeah, just two quick, very imperfect reflections on that. One is, I think I really like your idea about this is so it's probably not a new approach at all, but it's not a very well documented approach. And so let's get together and share the outcomes of what it looks like when you feed back to a community, what's been achieved and what's been done with that information to build a bit of an evidence base. And then the second one is reflecting on my own radicalization journey this week with regards to Ellie's work. I think everyone is just no one's very creative when they're in a state of thinking about survival and scarcity. And I definitely came into this week thinking, right, we're all on a mission to cut back to basics. How within those basics do we keep some modicum of keeping communities at the centre? And I was on a panel with Ellie on the first day, and I have to say, on that panel at that moment, I was like, this is all really important stuff, but it's not for now. And I just didn't hear it. And I heard it this time. I heard it this time, the second time round, when you were saying, if you don't think about languages and accessibility, you are not going to hear from the very people who you claim to be trying to reach. And the whole thing, the whole endeavour falls down. It took me a couple of turns and a couple of examples to hear it. And I think it's probably the same with this issue. If you're in a survival blinkered mindset, you're going to hear this issue as like, yeah, if we had another $1 million on the budget, fine, we can do it, but we've just got to focus on getting our bags of food or whatever it is. I think we need to continue to tell the story, continue to make the case, continue to give examples from everything we've done so that people get it and have the same radicalization moment that I've just had on this panel. So those would be my thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think I would probably just remind the sector and donors of the commitments that they make initially, you know, like we commit to localization, we commit to decolonization, we commit to participation, agency, placing the communities at the heart of the response. But if you don't do that meaningfully, if you don't take the steps to put them at the heart of the response, to listen to them, then we're forgetting about all the commitments, and the commitments are just buzzwords. The buzzword of the year is decol, you know, it's not really genuine decolonization then if you don't really go back and talk to them. And I think another thing I would say is from the review that we've done, we found the overall finding was that IDPs' needs are falling through the cracks. And so even more marginalized IDPs or IDPs with intersecting needs, IDPs who don't speak the predominant language are falling even, you know, lower, narrower cracks that we're not even seeing. So I think this is what I want to tell them, but haven't been very successful so far. I'm gonna try your idea. Let's see. Let's see.
Right, Ellie, over to you.
Was there management response?
Yes.
There was.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I can send you some links out.
Well done. You know, I realize I clearly need to get better at what I'm doing because it takes 2 shots at something.
It's my
Yeah.
mental state, it's not
No,
you,
I
it's where
don't-
everyone is right now.
It is, it is. I mean, I think if I don't have an easy answer. I do think sometimes, you know, maybe it's the same as communicating with communities. You need different, come at people from different angles with different tools. I found this week's GCS report with those very stark charts of, okay, this is the proportion of people that say they're getting what they need. Very compelling, you know, across, you know, some of the biggest, most protracted humanitarian emergencies that we're living in. We found that doing language maps, so you can see very visually, okay, these are actually the languages spoken in the areas where we're working, and which languages are in our team, okay. Can be really helpful, but I do think ultimately, in this survival mode, there's hopefully one thing that's going to come out of it, and it's probably not going to come out of it as perfectly or as disinterestedly as we all in this room would like it to. Even more of the burden of responding to emergencies is going to fall on the people affected by them. So if, you know, the people that are making decisions about this are the people with the money, if they want their money to go to something useful, then actually you need to be communicating with those who are falling the furthest. So I try hacking at them with that. Does that work?
Yeah, maybe just one other thing that if I can jump on the panel for a minute and throw in, I think, you know, as a researcher, it's up to us to set the interview questions most of the time. And so sneaking in a few of the questions that might help with that separate later. So we've started very easily with asking communities what language they speak at home. But I think the other question that somebody mentioned was around, I know, Jack, you meant this in a different way, but you said asking people what people want to find out. And I know you're meaning about the agencies at home, but I think that same idea could very well go with the people that we talk to as well. Like when we interview them, asking them, you know, what do you want to get out of this project? Why have you consented to an interview? Why are you willing to take part? Could bring out some really interesting things. And then that way, when we feed back to them, we are feeding back the things that they want to know. And so it's at the very least, even if we can't say we're going to change the world, we can at least say, well, this is what, you know, this is the answer to the question you have. And yeah, so, you know, as researchers, if you're a researcher and they're being a bit sneaky about what interview questions you put on the interview.
They've done, just on that, they've done it in Alnab recently with their State of the Humanitarian System report, where they went to the communities, told them, we do this report every 2-3 years. What things do you want us to research? And then they went back 2 years ago and then tested it, did validation workshops and tested those themes. Are they still relevant? Do they still want to hear about them? And I think it was the first time that they do it, but I think we've learned a lot on this process from that.
We've got a few more minutes. Any other reflections or experiences? Yeah, wait to the microphone. I know you speak very loudly. It's just for the people online.
Basically, I was gonna give an example. And so the thing is that in terms of what agencies want, I suppose the most specific example, which is most relevant here, is one of the things I've started to do regularly is to, when I do evaluations, whether or not they ask for them or not, I also evaluate the quality of their community feedback systems. Because very often they get the recommendation all the time, so, okay, how do we improve this thing? So we do an assessment, whether or not they ask for it, we do an assessment of their community feedback systems. And where they do have good quality feedback systems, we use that, we put that data into the evaluation report. And the result is that we almost always have recommendations about how to improve it more, where the gaps are and so forth. And that's one area where we see consistent improvement after these evaluations, because they're trying to think, we make the recommendations. I mean, in the management response, it's quite general recommendation, general management response. Who's responsible? What's going to happen? Maybe something, but it's not, it's not something really you can hold on to. So that's kind of, so it's more the kind of, yeah, it's important to get those voices, but we're there for a short period of time. What's going to make the difference is if it's a longer engagement, more quality engagement. So let's also focus on evaluating that systems as well, in addition to actually talking to people. Something like this.
Yes, we've got a question in front. Sneaking it in just at the end.
Thank you. I'm Rob Grace from Watchlist on Children in Armed Conflict, and I'm just interested to hear either from the panelists or anyone else in the room if there are existing resources. If I'm a researcher who wants to do a better job closing the loop, which I am, where can I turn? Whether it's is there a handbook or guidance documents, or is it more of like I don't know, or any other resources, but like to some type of researcher wants to do that, what should that, how can that researcher go about it? To what resources can they turn? Thank you.
I might turn to Ellie first, actually. I feel like Ellie has resources.
We have a couple of pieces for some of the issues that we've discussed. One is that, and I think maybe your colleague is going to share it online, a link to it online, which is no use to you in the room, but I'm getting to you. Is a piece of work that we did on language awareness in sensitive research that we did with the Dawson Support Hub for Safeguarding a couple of years back. That's available online. And the other thing around language is our language use data platform, which enables you to get at least a first pass on the languages that people are likely to speak and understand in the places that you're planning to work. So that's the starting point for when you get there. Who else are we missing if we use these? Yeah, for part of these issues that we've looked at.
Sophie, any?
No, I'm new to this world, so it might be that I'm missing something with others. I don't know of any, but I do think, based on what you're saying about let's document the outcomes based on what we're hearing from the room about how many people out there have already been doing this work. I would advocate for us just chucking together a Google Doc and sharing what we've done on this important issue and open source something real quick, because I think it's important.
I think I would echo Sophie, because when I started doing this work, I didn't know if anyone else was doing it. No one was really talking about it. And then when I spoke to Clear Global, okay, so there are some people doing it, and now GTS is doing it, you're doing it. So like, it's probably just like sitting together and writing our own experiences. We wanted to share, to see like who else is doing it in their own organizations, because it's not something that is at the forefront of our research. It's not something like, well, you're doing feedback loops effectively. And usually happens, for us at least, at OEI, it happened at the end, where you're like, but who's doing the feedback to affected communities themselves? We've done dissemination for the humanitarian sector, for the high level decision making, but what about communities? And then we started thinking about it. But I guess just like pulling our experiences together, that would be a great start for anyone else who's like wanting to do something about it. Yeah.
Just gonna just gonna say, if anyone else in the room knows of any resources, feel free to speak up. Or online, if you've got anything, put it in the chat, or I think I can see it when things pop up in the chat. Maybe I can't. And the other thing is that I think we definitely could make that Google Doc happen. We should have, if you've registered for this event officially, then we should have your email address anyway. And so maybe in our post-event wrap up, we can say something about, let's all, chuck good practice here and see what we can pull together in terms of a good practice handbook, but not really a handbook or a consideration. I don't really know what to call it. So yeah, so that's in my notes. We can definitely try to make that happen. Is there anything else in the room? Otherwise, I'll do a quick wrap up and we can, oh, yes. You could just wait for Nick. Nick's getting his steps in, so.
Just because I realize that there are so many researchers in the room, and I'm usually in rooms surrounded by child protection people. There are tons of resources out there, and yes, of course, you can go to Save the Children or UNICEF and ask for support. There are also huge child rights networks in almost every country. There are national actors that do this kind of work and engage children every day. There are community members. There are so many ways to engage children. So if I can be very shameless to every single researcher in the room, the next time you get handed a piece and say you want to understand this from the affected population, remind yourself that children may be half of that affected population, and that if you are not engaging them, you're missing them. And just be a bit bold, be a bit creative. If you don't know how to do it, ask somebody that does know how to do it, because there's lots of organizations out there that do. If you think you don't have enough time and money to do it, ask the commissioning agency for more time and money and tell them that if they don't do this, they're gonna miss the point. And it's like, you know, even on small things, if you're trying to do it on your own steam, and hopefully Sophie, you'll forgive me, because I really appreciated you pointing out the research you've recently done on the impact of aid cuts. I quickly looked at a few of them. I'm guessing, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that children weren't spoken to, but I can see from some of the gaps coming out that there are things that are happening to children that we know, for example, in DRC, that recruitment rates of children into armed groups have skyrocketed. Family separation has skyrocketed. We know that. It's not coming out in your conversations with community members. They talked about recruitment because some people are going towards armed groups for livelihoods. They're talking about adults. You're missing what's happening to kids. So just like a bit of a challenge for the room, because it's really important, and because child protection people can't do it. We need all of you.
Yeah, no, that's a really good kind of action for us as well. I have to admit, I usually shy away from reviewing children because it's a nightmare to get through our ethics. But if I'm completely honest, to talk to anyone under 18, there's rightly, you know, extra scrutiny on it, and that might be similar for lots of people in the room. So, yeah, great call to action for me to not be so lazy, basically, and actually try to get it done. So as we're wrapping up now, you will have seen that we left loads of stuff in all of the seats around you. One of those things is a feedback form. If you wouldn't mind filling that out and handing it into my colleague Almas in the back as you leave. These forms help us more than you will ever imagine. So just a plea to please fill it out. It is online. Kate has put a link in the chat to do it online. And then finally, just to say thank you to our wonderful panelists. Thank you to coming. Again, another thing my comms colleagues will kill me if I don't say, look us up online, follow us on LinkedIn and Blue Sky, sign up to our newsletter. We really are trying to kind of make sure that research is heard, available, etc. And hopefully not failing miserably at that. But yeah, sometimes you feel like you might be a voice in the dark, crying out. It's me? Yes. Yeah. Is it too early? It's right.
No.
Anyway. If you'll all join me in thanking our panelists, and then you can have a lovely rest of the day. Thank you.